Buckingham Palace issued a statement. No warning, no leaks beforehand, no precedent for the phrasing they chose. And the question now sitting in millions of homes, burning holes through headlines, timelines, and dinner table conversations is simple. Why now? Why in this way? And why with this tone of devastation instead of reassurance? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let's rewind for a moment. Because stories like this don't start with press releases. They start in moments no camera is allowed to capture. A stiff pause in a corridor, a hand that lingers too long on a banister, a glance exchanged between aides that lasts half a second longer than etiquette allows. Princess Charlotte of Cambridge isn't just a child in the royal line. She is the spark in viral balcony clips, the cheeky curtsy machine-gunned around the world. The young princess whose expressions launched memes, audience love, and 1,000 opinion columns about the modern monarchy inheriting its future. For a family defined by ceremony, rituals, and generational continuity, Charlotte represents something bigger than a title. She embodies emotional inheritance, a living emblem of what once was, and what could still be, which is why the public didn't just register this update. They felt it. But before the pain hit, confusion did. Because Buckingham Palace, an institution that historically choreographs every sentence, issued wording that seemed off-keel, carefully nonspecific, yet emotionally loaded, transparent, yet evasive, urgent, yet strangely curated for interpretation. The statement landed, like an anchor with no rope, heavy, sudden, and impossible to ignore. But think about it. Buckingham Palace doesn't confirm devastating updates 1 minute after they happen. Their announcements move through courtiers, advisors, royal physicians, legal approval, communications briefing, and timing strategy. Nothing is 1 minute ago in royal disclosure. Not births, not funerals, not abdications, not sickness. So when a royal statement opens with a timestamp tone as aggressive as breaking news, you have to ask, is this a reveal or a slip? Because it can be both. And what's interesting here is not just the update itself, but how it broke the illusion of omnipresent stability. For 1 second in history, the monarchy sounded human. Not regal, not institutional, not composed. Humanity breached the palace tone. And humanity, unlike royalty, is unpredictable. Was there foreshadowing? Yes, but only in hindsight. Because when you're watching a royal childhood unfold through curated public optics, your brain doesn't expect illness to enter the frame. You don't watch the joy and think, is this masking decline? You see 10-second reels, not medical dossiers. Yet looking backward, the signs were fictional but emotionally persuasive. The sudden withdrawal from a rumored school event, a scholarship celebration that never made social media, a carefully staged appearance at a local children's charity where royal aides stood in a tighter perimeter than usual, a palace photographer choosing angles that didn't involve the usual high-energy motion. Body language analysts fictionalizing stiffness into storylines of duty training instead of fatigue. You don't recognize the storm while you're inside the montage, only after the montage ends. And now, we see the montage was ending before we were told. But let's go deeper. Royal communications around sick heirs relies on a delicate union of stoicism and reassurance. When the Queen had a cold, we heard about her resilience. Prince Philip hospitalized? We heard about medical expertise and calm continuity. King George ill. War-era framing made sickness a matter of national endurance. Diana fainting? It became a narrative about pressures of duty, media, motherhood, and emotional confinement. Royal sickness always gets reframed into larger meaning. Duty, nation, crown, legacy, endurance. History refracted through fragility. But Charlotte? Charlotte was presented not as a lesson about duty, but as a blow, which breaks the pattern. It diverges from the archival blueprint. It destabilizes historic PR gravity, which is exactly why audiences filled the gap themselves. Let's play that gap forward. Because in the absence of royal transparency, public imagination becomes a kingdom of its own. And once imagination crowns a narrative, reality struggles to campaign against it. The public met the announcement with emotional projection before data projection. They didn't ask for lab results first. They asked, what does this mean? Is the future monarchy losing its light? Is this a tragedy echoing generational vulnerability? What is happening to the succession? What does this do to William's legacy? Kate. Where is Kate in this statement's emotional architecture? The palace didn't give a medical update. They gave an emotional trigger. So let's look at the emotional ecosystem that exploded because of it. Fans of the Cambridges felt parental dread. Monarchy traditionalists felt symbolic anxiety. Media critics felt protocol hypocrisy rising to the surface. They'll tell us everything about a tiara lineup, but fight silence wars around a suffering child? Gen Z social media commentary turned grief into collective concern, irony into critique, critique into engagement, engagement into retention. The palace confirmed Charlotte was seriously sick. But what serious meant was left unwritten, like an unsigned letter locked inside a protocol vault, which spawned the double narrative system now operating in parallel. The official palace line and the public's intuitive emotional line. One says illness. The other screams deterioration arc. And here's the twist. When institutions wield silence as protection, audiences can interpret silence as prognosis. When institutions write controlled vagueness, audiences rewrite clarity into tragedy. When institutions speak late, audiences assume deliberation. But when institutions speak immediately, audiences assume damage control. Everything everyone believed was hidden now felt half-confessed, half-estimated, and fully emotional. And let's be clear here. This outline is crafted not to diagnose a real child, but to illustrate the viral emotional magnetism of institutional opacity colliding with public empathy. This is speculative storytelling, not medical reporting. But while the palace guards truth timing, storytelling guards retention. Meaning is more addictive than data. Emotion more binge-worthy than protocol. And tragedy, with unanswered questions, is retention gold. Let's examine the retention triangle here. A beloved public figure. An institution that controls the narrative. A dramatic gap where ambiguity fuels hunger. Harry and Meghan's interviews fictionalize strength into brand narratives. But Charlotte's absence fictionalizes fragility into public concern. Both sides generate engagement through opposite energy signatures. And contradictions are far more retention-heavy than harmony. Charlotte was present everywhere. And then she was absent. The absence created noise louder than her viral balcony presence ever did. But the most fascinating angle isn't only the illness narrative. It's the monarchy confronting the one spectacle it cannot choreograph. Human decline. A child whose medical battle cannot be spun into resilience PR forever. The monarchy has contingency plans for everything, except unstoppable realities. Succession planning desks can speculate about what happens if a crown transfer document is needed in youth instead of elder age. Royal physicians can fictionalize hopeful briefings while bracing for noise just outside the gates. Aides can fictionalize corridor briefings that sound reassuring while feeling internally fractured by uncertainty. PR committees can fictionalize statements vague enough to protect, but emotional enough to land globally. But vulnerability doesn't follow committee approval channels. And now we're here. Buckingham Palace broke the pattern. The world broke the silence. And an entire audience sits watching, waiting for more than confirmation. They're waiting for the sentence the palace couldn't write yet. Because the cliff we reached wasn't in the statement. It was after it. And that is where this story begins. Because the palace confirmed illness. But they did not deny decline. And denial is always where truth hides longest. Which brings us to the final curiosity spike before we move forward. If the monarchy protects heirs through layers of silence, protocol, and timing, why did this story bypass all layers? If reassurance is the currency of British continuity, why did the tone sound like emotional alarm currency instead? If succession operates like clockwork, why did this announcement sound like countdown panic instead? The public is not reacting to a sentence. They are reacting to a signal that the palace gate open was not the end, but a beginning. And the one thing the palace did not add? A prognosis, a timeline, or a reassurance payoff, which means only one thing for retention-based storytelling. This update was not written to complete a narrative. It was written to pause one. Because what comes next is not inked yet. It is approaching. And no institution prepares a devastating update this fast unless the next question is already knocking at the gates. How bad does it get from here? How hidden was the battle before the reveal? And what does the palace know now that the world will only learn later? The world's eyes are locked on the gates. And protocol isn't the shield anymore. Curiosity is the crown now. Because the palace confirmation was a spark. And sparks light threads. Threads burn timelines. Timelines fuel retention. Retention builds kingdoms of attention. And now, with one statement, a royal child moved from meme history into fictional emotional history. A history still unwritten. Because the truth is this. You don't confirm devastation to conclude it. You confirm it because the next sentence is even bigger than the first. But that sentence is behind palace doors. Still waiting for approval. Still bracing for reception. Still shaping the arc. And still unknown to the world at large. Which is exactly why you're here watching this video. And why millions more will click after you do. Because the palace told us something. But it's the something they did not tell us that will pull you into the next chapter. And believe me, the next chapter begins where institutions stop writing. But storytelling never does. And the next reveal is already forming. Right behind the gates. But before it emerges, the precedent must crumble further. Because this confirmation wasn't the shockwave. It was the footstep before it. And those footsteps are getting louder. But what enters the frame next is even more devastating than the first announcement suggested. And no one is prepared for the next update when it finally breaks. The timestamp on the palace statement was designed to shock you. But the structure of royal announcements was designed to resist shock itself. So let me hit you with a real question to start us off. If a palace statement sounds rushed and emotionally catastrophic, are we witnessing transparency or tactical leakage? Because royal communications, especially concerning heirs, have an architectural rhythm, a procedure, a cadence that is older than the mass media that reports on them. And yet, this one slammed into the modern digital sphere like a notification set to max volume. To understand the update, we have to understand the institution that issued it. Buckingham Palace is not a hospital. It is a theater of continuity dressed in gold leaf and national permanence illusions. Every sentence is weighed like bullion. Every paragraph passes through invisible committees. And every disclosure involving a member of the line of succession is treated like state business. Who reviews the words? The monarch's senior private secretary, the communications chief, medical households, legal advisors, sometimes even regional governments if international travel or constitutional implications exist. The palace manages meaning and timing the way a Swiss watch manages seconds. Except here, the wording sounded less like chronometry and more like a fire alarm. But before we decode the linguistic choices, let's climb into the lineage of royal health disclosures, because the monarchy doesn't improvise. It references its own archives. Go back to King George VI. His illness, particularly his lung cancer diagnosis in 1951, was not publicly disclosed during his lifetime, and even when concerns grew, the palace leaned on euphemisms and resilient framing. Newspapers trained deference over detail. Public announcements mentioned strain or fatigue, but rarely anything resembling medical candor. When the world learned the fuller reality, it was posthumous narrative clarity, not immediate disclosure. The palace protected a monarch's privacy and a monarchy's optics simultaneously. Different era. Same strategy DNA. Illness should not destabilize the crown, even if it destabilizes the carrier. And then there was Princess Diana. 1980s eating disorder, bulimia revelations, fainting episodes, high public affection, tight palace PR perimeter. The palace refused to confirm diagnoses when reporters began connecting dots. Changed the subject. Elevated duty. Redirected vulnerability into a conversation about pressure, media, obligation, emotional labor. It was always, as it were, a redirection gambit. Diana's suffering was personal, but the palace anxiety around her suffering was institutional. And the tension between those two forces is exactly where our story's retention fuel lives. Now consider Queen Elizabeth II, whose medical issues were historically downplayed or disclosed only when necessary, and always reframed into continuity optics. When she caught a cold, the script was resilience. When she was hospitalized in 2013 with gastroenteritis, the communications were factual but calm. When her mobility issues became public in later years, they were acknowledged gently, never time-stamped like tragedy breaking news. The palace voice was consistent, composed, paternal in reassurance, monarchic in posture. So we have precedent. And precedent tells us this. Devastation language is rare. Urgency language is measured. Timestamps are almost ceremonial in tone themselves. The palace doesn't normally act like a breaking news ticker, which is why the phrase, devastating update confirmed 1 minute ago, didn't just break the internet. It broke royal messaging etiquette expectation cycles. But what about heirs specifically? Because Charlotte is not the first royal child the monarchy has had to protect under public interest weight. Prince William, heir once quieted by palace media buffers, faced childhood vulnerability rumors during turbulent eras. Catherine, Kate, herself underwent hospitalizations and media speculation during her pregnancies. The palace did not provide emotionally catastrophic updates. They provided, "We are monitoring the situation," infrastructure language. Common phrase. Catastrophe only in public imagination, not official voice. Princess Charlotte, being a grandchild of King Charles III and third in line to the throne, represents a level of institutional sensitivity that rivals state disclosure protocols. This is not a household update. This is crown-adjacent constitutional continuity. So when the wording comes out unusual, you know it was deliberate or under duress. But let's jump into the anatomy of this particular statement in our fictional storytelling universe. The phrase, seriously sick and her health only gets worse, is not just medically vague. It is emotionally precise. It doesn't inform your brain. It hijacks your gut. It's the kind of language used to manage legacy storms, not medical storms. And after centuries of palace PR behavioral conditioning, that deviation becomes the story itself. Now imagine the briefing room the moment before release. Palace communications officers with trembling teacups, not because their hands shake, but because Britain's favorite princess's narrative is shifting from public affection commodity into fragility inheritance mythology. An aide sliding a draft across a table, legal eyes squinting at the word serious, medical advisors suggesting it be clipped entirely, PR advisors arguing ironically that ambiguity is safer until ambiguity itself becomes a headline cannibal. The monarch's office pushing for distance, the parents pushing for privacy, history pushing for echo, social media pushing for immediacy, opposing forces all pulling the same sentence in different directions. That's the contradiction, the retention magnet. The more you resist clarity, the more the narrative element catches fire. Because if the royal family had denied decline early, the world might have cooled. But they didn't deny. They confirmed illness without denying deterioration. But let's break this down further. Serious could mean many things medically. But seriously sick and only getting worse is medically slim on data, but heavy on narrative arc direction. It primes your brain for a decline storyline. Is that a hospital phrase? No, that's a storytelling phrase. The palace outsourced half the medical mystery by accident or by strategy. Now let's pull apart a particularly retention-rich linguistic moment. Royal disclosures historically rely on passive constructions. Is under the care of medical staff, continues to be monitored, has postponed public engagements. These are sink-in phrases. Deep state calm language. No emotional projection command signals. No sure-punch pacing. No dramatic arc invites. But here, we saw active deterioration phrasing, which is almost unprecedented. It's almost a broken rule. Almost an archivist's deleted line accidentally greenlit. And accidents are impossible to prove or deny when the institution controls the receipts. But while the palace controls the receipts, the public controls the meaning. And meaning, unlike receipts, scales fast. And now, audiences globally are reacting not because they saw Charlotte's medical chart, but because the palace didn't write one. That is the core of this retention triangle. Meaning over data, absence over presence, and worry over reassurance. The crown doesn't crumble because of illness. It crumbles because of narrative voids that force the public to fill the gaps themselves. Consider the implications now in our fictional storytelling arc. What happens if a young heir becomes a medical vulnerability instead of a continuity emblem? Monarchies have policies, but children generate empathy physics different from adult PR physics. Children convert worry into activism, activism into commentary, commentary into retention, retention into digital loyalty ecosystems. In other words, Princess Charlotte's illness is no longer just a fictional health storyline. It is a collision event. Monarchy stability optics versus public empathy optics. Historical patterning versus digital immediacy patterning. Generational archive cadence versus 1 minute ago internet cadence. Even if you were a royal communications architect, how would you stop this momentum? By releasing more clarity? Or by retreating further into opacity? Because either direction feeds retention through different psychological urge. The more clarity, the more you reward loyal audiences. The more opacity, the more you spark new audiences thirsty for answers. And now, we're not even at the core darkness of the story yet. Embargo agreements. Fictional but persuasive. Historically, the palace negotiates media blackout terms when necessary. Hospital visits can be temporarily embargoed. Schools, sports contests, childhood appearances can be pre-negotiated and sublimated into non-disclosure pacts. The public assumes this is to protect childhood innocence. Insiders know it is to buffer exposure volatility. The palace manages the distribution of royal minors' visibility the way tech companies manage unauthorized firmware leaks. Controlled access institutions. Charlotte's schooling would theoretically place her in a semi-public sphere. But royalty doesn't attend ordinary institutions the way ordinary children do. They attend institutions that agree to the rules. Private schools. Select academies. Charity visits staged on palace calendar-approved architecture days. Medical visits quietly scheduled around optics-friendly public service holidays. The monarchy doesn't isolate minors. It selects their ecosystems. The body language misdirection engine. A child who is tired in public may be framed as shy, or studious, or receiving training. Yes, training is the monarchy's favorite euphemism for anything that looks out of alignment. Signals that resemble stress, fatigue, or stiffness can be reinterpreted into personality narratives. Charlotte, for instance, missing a sticky viral balcony motion moment 1 year might have been pitched as rehearsing emotional composure for future roles, not needing to appear constantly. Information channels using paternal shielding. If the palace confirms illness, it typically reframes to care, not prognosis. Because prognosis invites narrative ownership by media analysts. It moves the story from institution-safe language into speculation land. Care is containment. Prognosis is summit terrain loss. Now let's connect this to our fictional timeline arc energy. Charlotte's appearances had grown sporadic weeks before the devastating statement dropped. Not vanished entirely. Not low frequency. Just low enough to trigger royal watchers, and high enough that her absences felt conspicuous to billions. A child previously framed as one of the most charismatic balcony moments carriers suddenly missing from the lithograph of digital familiarity? That is narrative inconsistency stronger than scandal. Now imagine technical optics like this. 1 minute you see Charlotte waving on repeat in global social feeds. The next minute, she's missing from 13 consecutive rumored engagements. And when children vanish from brands, audiences assume rebranding is coming. Except this wasn't rebranding. This was deterioration planning, which flips the storytelling polarity entirely. The palace, in its speculative self-contained fortress, may have thought silence was safer territory. But as we explored in Chapter 1, silence without denial is ignition fuel for public narrative takeover. So instead of calming the story, the palace created 2 dominions. One institutional, one digital, both addictive for entirely different reasons. The Cambridge household, meanwhile, must fictionally grapple with a contradiction older than monarchy. Duty expects endurance. Parenthood expects secrecy. Media expects access. Public empathy expects honesty. Constitution expects succession continuity. And children expect care, not crowns. These forces don't align. They collide, which in our fictional storytelling blueprint now becomes the emotional tension map of Chapter 2. Imagine, for instance, Kate Middleton, whose life has been defined by constructing a softer, maternal monarchy narrative, suddenly becoming the emotional barricade internally advocating for Charlotte's privacy. In our story, she must look at a public appetite that loves her daughter dearly. While watching her daughter decline into a narrative arc even PR cannot stabilize forever. Prince William fictionally sits at his own contradiction intersection. He is an heir who once benefited from palace opacity himself, and a parent who now fears its doubling effect. Which brings us to a very retention-heavy irony dosage because the user requested irony tones. Scandals, interviews, F1 media arenas, Amazon MGM fictional celebrity collisions, Netflix lifestyle meltdowns. These are storms PR can ride like a jet ski. But illness? Decline? The very thing that once shaped George VI's privacy era, now shaping a modern child optics crisis? You can't speedboat over it forever, because every fortress has a weakness, and the palace revealed theirs when they confirmed illness without denying decline. Now let's examine vanished public appearance psychology physics. If this were a civilian child, illness updates would come from doctors, hospitals, or guardians. But because this is a royal heir fictionalization arc, the palace had to speak, even if the parents wanted silence. The announcement timing felt modern and shocking to you because the palace used digital-era frank language templates, which signal a larger retention pattern. Quick updates work psychologically better for modern audiences, except here they backfired emotionally, sparking questions faster than reassurance could campaign the narrative. Let's examine something deeper: monarchy narrative control limits. Monarchies don't just protect children. They protect perceptions of the institution's ability to protect children. Once that perception cracks, you don't just fear the illness of the heir. You fear the vulnerability of the system entrusted with the heir. That is institutional anxiety. That is national dread. That is digital retention terrain fuel. Charlotte's absence exposed not just vulnerability, but monarchy's procedural fragility. Compartment contradiction architecture, optimization miscalculations in wording, and public empathy mechanics colliding with protocol mechanics, which raises questions so engaging, you almost feel like you're watching two stories at once. Story 1. The official illusion of protected royal youth. Story 2. The decline arc the public believes is hiding in the shadows. But the bigger twist? In speculative narrative land, the quieter the palace, the louder the audience imagination. And imagination doesn't require approval cycles. So now let's build the final emotional escalation before we drop the Chapter 2 cliffhanger, fiction retention style, no bolding. Kate once said Charlotte was feisty. Was that personality or camouflage? William once joked that Charlotte was steering the ship. Was that foreshadowing or irony? The palace confirmed illness, but not decline timing. Was that tactical or fear-driven messaging? Schools canceled events? Or engagements canceled the school? A princess absent from feeds? Or feeds bracing for grief rehearsals? Public statements rushed? Or internal hemorrhage preempted? And the biggest audience question of all, was Charlotte's invisibility the symptom? Or was it the warning? Final cliffhanger line. And that silence you felt ringing after the first statement? It wasn't caution. It was choreography for something heavier still. The next update isn't about illness privacy anymore. It's about how long they can shield its worsening arc. And the shield is already splintering. Behind the gates. What if the most protected child in the world was never the story? What if the protection was? Because now we're standing at the threshold where rumor graduates into storyline, and storyline metastasizes into belief. Not medical belief. Narrative belief. Royal watchers don't search symptom lists first. They search for signal disruptions. And once the palace confirmed Charlotte was seriously sick, without denying decline, the signals became the evidence economy. So let's go into the fictional leaks, contradictions, and emotional landmines buried under royal tapestry itself. Imagine a royal medical household staffer, not a spokesperson, just someone with a lanyard, late for a sandwich break, who once overhears a corridor briefing they never signed an NDA for. In our speculative arc, the corridors speak more truth than the briefings meant to travel outside them. Because here's the thing about vaults. Things can be locked in them, but sounds can't. The palace confirmed illness. But insiders, fictional but narratively credible, lean toward a more catastrophic compass direction entirely. And the whispers didn't start this week. They started when the world was still laughing at curtsies and analyzing the angles of balcony waving frequency. But now, we have a new set of questions piling faster than coronation invites. If the palace knew she was seriously sick, why did they let the deterioration rumors reach the public first? If privacy was the objective, why confirm an emotionally devastating tone instead of neutral institutional calm? If care was the priority, why did the world feel prepared for grief instead of reassured by expertise? And if leaks are the story currency here, who wrote the leaks? Let's look at the leak architecture of our fictional world. Leak vector number 1, the medical insiders. In our story universe, insiders paint a picture not through formal breach, but informal gravity shift. Medical staff won't leak a chart, but someone might leak the emotional temperature around the chart without disclosing the chart itself. It's the difference between saying, "There is a storm," and handing someone a weather radar printout. One is illegal. The other is storytelling inevitability. In our speculative blueprint, this was the first fault line. Rumors began circulating that Charlotte had been removed from certain physical activities. At first, royal fans thought it was prioritization of education, a shift toward focus, monarchy software update, studious personality patch 2.0. Because audiences prefer developmental arcs over vulnerability arcs in children. But now, we see development wasn't the version update. Decline was. Leak vector number 2. Courtiers with conflicting interests. You ever watch a movie and wonder which character is secretly loyal to which motive? Welcome to Chapter 3. Because in every palace ecosystem, loyalty isn't binary. It's layered, tribal, generational, opportunistic, emotional, professional, ideological, personal, protective. And in our fictional world, every layer fights for narrative custody. One courtier imagines shielding Charlotte as protecting the monarchy's heir. Another imagines shielding Charlotte as protecting the Cambridge legacy optics instead of the crown optics. Another believes shielding makes decline look worse when eventually disclosed. Another wants early candor to avoid public shock once decline is undeniable. And one whispered something that never should have left committee corridors. The family wants protection, the crown wants containment, and the child wants care, not narrative. Which was exactly the moment leak storytelling became believable enough for public adoption. Leak vector number 3, schedule disruptions. Buckingham Palace schedules children like celestial events. Rare, intentional, strategic, public morale positive. But the universe panics when stars disappear from orbit without explanation. In our speculative timeline, there were rumored cancellations that didn't make sense individually, but once stitched together formed something resembling deterioration choreography. A school theater performance quietly postponed. A regional charity visit replaced last minute by another royal. A Christmas concert where Charlotte was originally rumored to attend, suddenly reframed into a sibling-only appearance year. The infamous "Where's Charlotte?" comment storm bubbling long before the "she's seriously sick" wording ever finally dropped. Each cancellation alone looked ordinary. In sequence, it looked like shielding. In hindsight, it looked like decline scaffolding. And sequence is where narrative becomes addictive. Now let's inject the emotional beats and contradictions that make audiences stay glued. Kate Middleton, public emblem of maternal monarchy relatability, would fictionally advocate for shielding as parenthood, not protocol. But shielding inadvertently makes the public assume prognosis, not protection. You mean to protect innocence. The world interprets prognosis worsening, which is tragically ironic retention fuel. William, once shielded by the palace as minor himself, benefits fictionally from the strategy he now fears will double back to harm his daughter's optics the way echoes double sound in tunnels. That irony isn't just poetic. It's structural. But here's the deeper tension. The public loves Charlotte not because of the protocol, but because she once looked like the protocol added levity to her, not fragility. Which flips everything about the narrative gravity. Because illness isn't the tragedy here in speculative universes. It's a child confronting expectation mythology, not human care. And while adults leak scandals, children leak questions. For example, why did Kate look more emotional recently? Was that worry or preparation? Why did William stop making balcony jokes? Was that stoicism training or emotional barricade? Why were aides unusually perimeter tight in fictional local clips? Protection or deterioration? Why does the statement sound devastating? Because devastation invites empathy, and empathy invites loyalty, and loyalty invites retention, and retention builds audience dominions that even monarchies envy. Even if the story is fictional, the emotional physics are real. Because humanity doesn't destabilize monarchy, narrative void does. Now let's look at generational storytelling energy collisions. Prince Harry and Meghan's interviews fictionalize strength into public brand narratives. Charlotte's absence fictionalizes fragility into public concern narratives. One family branch feeds visibility. Another family branch feeds invisibility. Both feed retention differently. But contradictions are the empire of curiosity itself. People assume interviews exist to reveal strength. But what if announcements exist to hide deterioration? People assume visibility exists to showcase air continuity. But what if invisibility exists to prepare the world for succession seismic rewrites early instead of late? People assume minor engagement invites innocence. But what if minor engagement cancellations prepare digital grief economies instead? That's the question fuel consumers. And you, the audience? You're consuming fuel, not answers. Now let's slow pacing a bit to deepen the middle section of our 2,200 words. Royal minors historically don't have their medical narratives disclosed publicly. They are insulated not by secrecy alone, but by deference infrastructure. But once the palace deviates from deference style into digital frankness style, you begin interpreting the mechanics, not the message. This is what happens when institutional tone moves into internet-native syntax density. It collapses distance between palace chronometry and digital urgency, which is great for retention, terrible for reassurance optics. But analyze this. What exactly does seriously sick and only getting worse do psychologically? It invites a decline arc. It makes audiences brace instinctively. It spawns corridor theories. It turns parental fear into institutional fear. It weaponizes empathy into loyalty. It transfers narrative custody from palace to public. And narrative custody is more addictive than confirmation itself. That is exactly why you clicked, and exactly why millions more will click after you. Now let's inject a storytelling analogy for retention, slow beat. The monarchy is a castle of mirrors. Every reflection is curated. But mirrors don't hide cracks. They multiply them. The palace tried to angle Charlotte's reflection into innocence corridors. The world reflected back decline corridors. Double mirrors. Double echoes. Double narrative. Now let's escalate into the final cliff moment. Rewind our universe logic. Public believes monarchy is fortress strong. But fortress becomes story when vulnerability becomes thematic. Public thinks crown is symbol. But symbol becomes trap when child is carrier of expectation mythology instead of care. Public wants doctors. Palace wants timing control. Parents want shielding. Nation wants continuity. Media wants access. Audience wants meaning spikes. And meaning doesn't require approval cycles. Which leads us to only one possible dramatic escalator conclusion in our speculative arc before we transition. This statement wasn't rushed to confirm illness. It was rushed to preempt the revelation that comes after it. The real story wasn't the sickness at all. It was the machinery that had to protect it long before confirmation had to drop. And that machinery is about to break its next rule before the world even has time to catch its breath. Because what comes next isn't just worse health. It's worse protocol collapse timing. And you're about to see the one thing a monarchy never reveals on a timestamp. Who has narrative custody of the air when secrecy fails, and denial isn't written into the first statement. Because the next corridor isn't just louder. It's cracking. Right now? Right under the crown itself. If hindsight exposed denial, what does the present expose? Because the palace statement was a match strike. But the flame pattern is just beginning to show its shape now. Royal watchers love a timeline most when the timeline finally stops behaving like a costume department and starts behaving like a breadcrumb trail. And with Charlotte, in this universe of framed worry and controlled optics, the breadcrumb trail didn't come from tabloids first. It came from the palace calendar itself. So let's now conduct that fictional investigation the way conspiracy analysts map flight radar blips after a plane disappears. Picture this. Months before the statement, the Cambridge household's public itinerary was dense with symbolic appearances. Christmas carols, regional goodwill stops, school photography shoots, folklore-style engagements where youth cushions crown anxiety instead of triggering it. This was the normal optics rhythm. A rhythm that comforted audiences into assuming permanence was guaranteed by tradition, managed by courtiers, safeguarded by legacy. Because a royal crisis involving a minor isn't retention-heavy because the world saw the illness. It's retention-heavy because the world saw the masking. And once masking is visible, symbolism collapses into vulnerability. Let's start with the early signs. But remember, early signs are only obvious once the update forces recontextualization. Sign number 1. The shuttered balcony energy. Charlotte's last full viral balcony moment carried energy that was oddly edited. The waving segment was shortened. Not by accident, by optics trimming. Palace photographers historically give heirs full levity frames. This time, the levity frame tightened. A short frame in a monarchy montage works psychologically like a lens crop, tightening focus or tightening concealment. Ask yourself, did they tighten focus or tighten perimeter? Sign number 2. The tightened aid formation perimeter. In our fictional structural timeline, aides began standing closer. Why does this matter? Monarchies historically use proximity like punctuation. When attendants stand tighter around minors, it can be guarding innocence or guarding narrative volatility. How do you isolate an heir without the world noticing? You isolate her by never fully isolating her. Just enough appearances to avoid public alarm. Perimeter tightened because care was not yet public. Protection is calm when invisible. It's alarming when visible. Sign number 3. The fictional strongest team statement versus growing apart energy. One branch of the royal narrative ecosystem broadcasts bold love and collaboration brand. She didn't attend a rumored regional youth poetry celebration. She wasn't photographed the day her classmates took group school photos. A Southern England children's hospital visit was replaced last minute with another royal sibling or cousin cameo instead. The feisty steering the ship quotes vanished from William's soundbites. Christmas choir attendance was reframed into minimal appearances but maximum symbolism settings, where observers might narratively reinterpret solemn presence into fatigued presence. Poetic irony. People were analyzing Christmas innocence optics, but didn't know they were analyzing medical choreography absence optics instead. Because audiences stay when pacing shifts between short punches and longer narrative tunnels. Let's inject those pacing beats now. Punchline. The palace says she's unwell. Longer tunnel. But unwell is a spectrum monarchy uses like watercolor, intentionally blurred at the edges. Punchline. They confirmed illness without denying decline. Longer tunnel. And denial is exactly where the truth waits longest in royal crisis archives. Punchline. This story bypassed deference PR rules. Longer tunnel. Because narrative doesn't ask permission to take custody when permission is withheld by opacity. Punchline. All illusions collapsed the moment the cameras stopped? Longer tunnel. No, they collapsed because audiences noticed the cameras had stopped first. And that's the crux of this chapter. They were hiding Charlotte, but they never wanted you to notice they were hiding Charlotte. And denial works for retention only until a storyteller asks the question you can't unsay. What happens if protection fails before the heir grows old enough to redefine identity through duty instead of decline? Answer. The story stops being the protected child. It becomes the protocol's fragility fracture, which is why this update techno-hijacked public emotion first and public logic only later. Now let's escalate into a retention-driven emotional crescendo before the chapter collapse point. If Diana's vulnerability cracked palace illusion optics in the 90s because the world loved the mother and feared the institution, now imagine Charlotte's vulnerability cracking illusion optics 2 generations later. Not because the palace disclosed her health directly, but because they let you witness the psychological disintegration cascade around withheld wording instead of provided wording. And digital audiences are different beasts than newspaper audiences. Digital audiences don't just wait for updates. They hunt them. They map them. They post them. They trend them. They convert them into episodic belief economies before closure. They elongate retention across hours instead of days because cliffhangers beat publishing deadlines entirely. You're not watching a health crisis. You're watching the system confront the one crisis it assumed it could still contain. Public imagination doesn't wear a crown. It doesn't need approval. It doesn't kneel. It stands at the gates demanding a timeline. Which brings us to the final irony twist before the chapter 4 cliffhanger line. They confirmed illness fast, but only after the world had already diagnosed decline narratively. That is not PR control. That is PR triage. If the crown was the script and silence was the actor, then what role does panic play when the heir is only a child? Because here is the truth every royal biography tiptoes around but never stamps into a headline 1 minute after it happens. A monarchy can survive controversy. It can even monetize it, narratively speaking. But fragility in a child heir, once priced into public imagination long before the palace issues calm wording scaffolding, becomes the one narrative asset the institution has no calibration formula for. And Charlotte wasn't just priced into imagination. She was indexed, with audience affection dividends stacking higher with each viral clip, cheeky curtsy, balcony wave, school candids, folklore-adjacent charm-coded engagements. All momentum, no liability disclaimers. Until now. So in Chapter 5, we scale the emotional inheritance marketplace dynamics colliding in real time. Let's go deeper. Not fluff deep, structural deep. Imagine the Crown's historical PR architects for child heirs. They don't just manage public reaction to illness. They manage public reaction to potential succession destabilization caused by illness. That is a separate protocol. When adult royals fall ill, the palace invokes resilience language like a default operating system. Calm statements, bulletins gently curated, updates measured to avoid emotional market volatility. But when a child, prematurely crowned by the public as the modern monarchy's spark future package, begins slipping out of that optics orbit, PR must confront a contradiction older than coronation fonts themselves. Duty narratives rely on strength. Children narratives rely on empathy. Empathy narratives collapse hierarchy and demand story progression clarity without caring about approval cycles. Approval cycles fight empathy because empathy converts ambiguity into belief before belief must be formally disbanded by denial. Except denial never came in the first update. And once denial is missing, deterioration becomes the throne occupant in the public dialogue. Now what happens when deterioration sits on a throne everyone thought resilience had reserved? You don't contain the reaction, you extend it. And Chapter 5 is where public reaction storylines mature into full mythological arc belief economics. So let's now climb back into the lineage for a moment, and then leap forward again. Because ancestry is retention glue when deployed strategically. William, once a minor shielded by palace communication bubbles himself, benefits from the very deference architecture he narratively fears will injure his daughter's truth optics the way echo tunnels injure sound clarity. The palace once shielded William with passive language scaffolding. But this era is digital, allergic to velour. Audiences don't accept deference quietly. They tweet it ironically. And irony keeps viewers watching longer than certainty ever did. Kate, maternal monarchy optics sculptor, becomes a retention vector collision point herself. The mother who wants privacy, but a mother whose brand authenticity, fictionally crafted by the public, not the palace, is spiking with each hour of absence around Charlotte's rumored decline. Imagine the contradiction commentary potential advantages. The monarchy would historically isolate minors with careful optics management. But Charlotte's visibility precedent made isolation itself the headline, not the illness. Let's examine the fictional signals the world began reconstructing into worsening health belief economics. Because signals function like story receipts when chart receipts are withheld. Charlotte's rumored reduced energy during private family visits, reframed as education-focused patch earlier, now reinterpreted as fatigue breadcrumb. School life patterns subtly fictionalized by insiders. Not published widely, but whispered widely enough to form narrative adoption. A children's poetry celebration event rumored to involve her, quietly fictionally replaced. Monarchy watchers saw absence. Public assumed deterioration scaffolding. Monarchy vulnerabilities don't enter the frame with formal announcements. They enter the frame with replacements. And replacements at this frequency scale aren't accidents. They're protocol symptoms. So let's now fictionalize the next stage of worry ascension. A royal communications briefing fire drill imagined by aides, advisors, and physicians behind palace doors. Not the announcement itself, but the tone around it. Because a palace statement sounding devastating instead of merely concerned resembles internal pressure more than public reassurance. Internal pressure is a kingdom monarchies manage privately until private kingdoms get too loud, too heavy, to unsustainably contradictory for public silence. They confirmed illness, but the public adopted decline long before denial could intervene. which flips historical blueprint vector physics entirely. Because once a beloved child heir's absence is publicly recognized, it doesn't just spawn theories. It spawns historical parallel, dread mythology, adoption economics. This is how digital retention works. People don't just want to know the story. They want to feel ownership of its arc. So now audiences globally don't want the Palace Committee medical version. They want the parental fear version. But the parental fear version can't be broadcast by the palace. Because monarchy doesn't just protect minors. It protects the institutional perception that it protects minors better than empathy does. Empathy doesn't kneel to approval channels. It hunts them down with notifications. And notifications happened before vocabulary instrumentation did. So let's examine the retention payoff logic triangle of this chapter. She once appeared too much for decline to look harmless. The palace confirmed illness without denying decline, triggering narrative takeover by the public imagination market. Immediate timestamp tone sounded almost like preemptive damage control, not medical neutral calm, meaning the institution is bracing for a story bigger than the sentence they released. Which brings us to a conflict that hooks digital viewers the way coronation hooks work ceremonially for monarchy continuity planners. When the heir is beloved for emotional spontaneity, and the institution avoids spontaneous clarity, clarity rebrands itself into deterioration belief. Now let's inject pacing variation, retention tactics, like requested. Punchline. Charlotte wasn't the first minor shielded by deference language. But she's the first minor whose deference language collapsed into devastation, phrasing so fast. Longer tunnel. Because deference works for newspapers. But newspapers don't build retention payouts. Digital audiences do. Punchline. What if the palace sounded fast because they were bracing for grief timing? Longer tunnel. Grief isn't announced early by monarchies. It's announced when they can't rewrite it anymore. Punchline. You're not watching a press release decode. You're watching the fracture patterns of protective silence physics collapsing because belief escalates faster than wording committees ever move. Longer tunnel, which is the exact moment retention ascension becomes unstoppable, beyond denial, beyond deference, beyond calm, beyond committees. Empires of attention don't require handwritten receipts. They build their own archives digitally. Now let's escalate into the close of Chapter 5's build-up. If the palace once used silence as armor for William, they now fictional armor Charlotte through wording vagueness instead of denial vagueness. But vagueness is interpreted like prognosis, not protection, which pushes empathy over protocol physics first and logic only later. Insiders may not leak a medical chart, but they already leaked the emotional gravity around its existence long before the public knew what the phrase serious really meant. Royal physicians can offer hopeful briefings internally in speculative universes, but hopeful briefings are not confirmations. They are campaign promises. Campaign promises are addictive. But they don't disband narrative takeover storms from digital audiences whose optics expectations have already been disrupted by absence patterns first, announcement wording second. So now the real unseen force shaping all corridors is this. Not the illness, but how the illusion of containment cracked before the containment vocabulary could be issued. That's why you're still watching, isn't it? But here's the final twist before we exit. If the palace sounded like countdown instead of calm, the thing they are preempting has more legacy weight than symptoms. Because one thing a monarchy never rushes into: a devastating timestamp update concerning a minor, unless the next revelation is already sprinting toward you faster than committee approval desks ever do. Final cliffhanger. And the crown doesn't tremble at diagnosis, but it trembles when narrative ownership shifts away from it before denial could intervene. If the enemy isn't scandal, and it isn't sickness, then what exactly is Buckingham Palace fighting behind the curtain? Because now we're entering the chamber where the story stops being what happened and starts being who is rewriting the rules for what happens next. Royal crisis management has a hierarchy. Monarch at the top, heir optics close behind, communications chiefs shaping narrative borders, legal advisors guarding vocabulary ramparts, medical advisors guarding privacy borders. And then there is the family unit. Separate from the crown, separate from committees, separate from the institution, and yet trapped inside the institution when the heir is a royal minor. So let's fictionalize the structural tension point that matters now. Buckingham Palace doesn't panic because it fears losing the person. It panics because it fears losing narrative custody of the person. And custody battles are public when the public already believes decline is inevitable. But let's rewind the crisis room in our speculative world, where the statement opens catastrophic. Palace advisors imagined the public would panic at Charlotte being seriously sick. They did not imagine the public would panic at the palace sounding seriously human while announcing it. And sounding human is dangerous for monarchy optics, because monarchy depends on emotional distance scaffolding, which brings us to the first structural tension point. The Queen is no longer the only one who writes. In every monarchy map, the monarch historically owns narrative approval cycles. But this is 2025 and beyond. The digital audiences are impatient sovereigns. They issue verdicts faster than palace courtiers issue drafts. In our universe arc, that means the palace has to manage not just information, but narrative competition. So when Charlotte vanished from optics orbit first, announcement vocabulary second, the palace lost first strike narrative ownership before they could even deploy denial architectures. And they know it, which is why every subsequent sentence feels like it is holding the door shut instead of opening it. Now imagine a senior communications aide walking back into the briefing room after the first statement detonated retention economics. A long table, 40 drafts printed, 20 rejecting resilience language, 10 rejecting denial language, 5 rejecting timestamps, 5 suggesting shorter disclosures, none medically specific, all emotionally loaded. The palace, fictionalized here, cannot correct a gut reaction that has already matured into narrative belief. They can only create a counter-ecosystem storyline for retention. And ecosystems are inherited, which brings us to another retention-rich layering irony point. Harry and Meghan left the institution to build narrative freedom. Charlotte's story remained trapped inside it. But tragedy breaks free faster than interviews ever do. Which means Charlotte's narrative became the competitor Harry and Meghan never wanted to feud with. But feuding was inevitable once narrative void reached its mass adoption phase. Now let's fictionalize the corridor psychology. Corridor number 1. Secrecy versus succession. The royal family doesn't debate medical data internally out of cruelty. They debate it out of generational optics survival instinct. An heir too early disclosed medically undermines the perception of crown permanence. A health disclosure involving a minor, handled wrong, undermines the perception the monarchy protects children better than tabloids fabricate deterioration narratives. Except the monarchy tone sounded devastated, which is the opposite of stable institution architecture tone. So secrecy disintegrated into vulnerability theme first, succession anxiety second, medical semantics most last. But instead of releasing more clarity, Buckingham Palace pivoted further into protective opacity territory. Why? Because if they released real diagnoses publicly, they wouldn't just be speaking medically. They'd be competing narratively. And competing narratively would mean relinquishing the very thing monarchies historically fight hardest to own. Meaning, legacy, public emotional arc direction. And meaning is addictive when withheld because ambiguity rewrites itself into story structure scaffolding for digital engagement. Corridor number 2. The Cambridge household crisis within a kingdom of optics. Imagine William and Kate inside this story mapping what could not be announced. A mother's fear. A father's stoicism. A constitutional monarchy continuity obligation inertia heavier than a medical scan. That's the tragedy. And tragedy invites love. Love invites retention. Retention invites dominions. Dominions demand progression. Progression demands updates. Updates demand meaning clarity. Meaning clarity isn't medically drafted yet, which is our fictional loop, spiraling upward. But then a contradiction hit. The public doesn't just love the heir. It fears the institution trusted with the heir. If Diana cracked monarchy optics because the cameras loved the mother but feared the institution, Charlotte cracks monarchy optics because the public loves the minor but fears the withheld wording economy that plays out like a deterioration saga. And every saga demands a caretaker hero, even if no hero exists medically across succession protocols. But here's another twist. The palace probably confirmed this now because they know something bigger is coming. A monarchy that controls legacy messaging wouldn't dispatch a devastating update. Without a containment appendix, unless another story already had more inertia than Buckingham Palace realized until it was too late. Ask yourself, why did the palace speak immediately? Why did it sound devastated instead of clinical? Why no denial of decline? Why no timeline for recovery? Why does the world feel braced for meaning loss instead of medically reassured? Was Charlotte the subject? Or was Charlotte the trigger device for narrative repositioning before grief re-enters the monarchy montages the way Diana's vulnerability once did himself? Except this time, the vulnerability subject is not an adult. It's not a scandal. It's not a fainting episode. It's not a constitutional abdication moment. It's a child everyone emotionally crowned as future continuity optics, which monarchy never allows to slip into narrative ownership by the public. And yet, it slipped. Because the palace confirmed illness without denying decline. And a denial, once missing, rewrites the meaning vector itself. Now let's deploy pacing variation, retention style exactly as requested. Short punchline. You saw illness confirmation like a dagger because the palace phrased it like emotional alarm architecture instead of chronometry reassurance. Slower tunnel. But look deeper. They weren't fighting the illness. They were fighting the loss of narrative custody. Custody destabilizes legacies faster than scandal, interviews, or even hospital dossiers ever do. Short punchline. A vanishing minor heir is never news. It's a story precursor. Slower tunnel. Which means every disappearance, rumor, cancellation, and misdirection was not disease control. It was narrative damage control for what comes next. Short punchline. You think this chapter is about sickness. It isn't. It's about rewriting monarchy communications patterning publicly before the next revelation makes rewriting impossible. Slower tunnel. Because if they rush a devastating story now,